Today we're covering the best rogue decks in Yu-Gi-Oh! To find out which ones have the best chance to compete against the top meta decks. What's potion? You got Matt here, and welcome back to another competitive Yu-Gi-Oh! Video. Today we're talking about rogue decks that you're not expected to see too often in high-level competitive events. We're gonna find out which decks you really have to worry about and which decks are not so scary in this specific format. So if you're excited for the video, then make sure to smash the like button. If this video hits 250 likes, I'll know you want to keep seeing more tier lists on the channel. And of course, subscribe to the channel as well if you like competitive Yu-Gi-Oh!, including deck profiles, combo guides, meta discussions, guides on how to beat the best decks, and videos just like this one. But with that being said, here is your guide for the best rogue decks in the April 2024 competitive Yu-Gi-Oh! Format. Let's jump into it. So first things first, every single person has a different definition for what is or isn't a rogue deck. For example, some people might think that a deck has to see no competitive success at all to be considered rogue. Some people think it has to be a very minor amount of success, and other people think that the representation has to be very low. In my opinion, a rogue deck is a combination of success levels and of representation. For example, if a deck top 32's a YCS but only had like 10 players on it, that to me is a rogue strategy. There just aren't enough people playing the actual deck itself, but even though it found some success. On the other hand though, if a strategy doesn't top a YCS but there's 100, 200 players on it, that to me is also going to be considered rogue as well, because if a deck is really that good, then there should be at least 1 or 2 or even 3 people that are topping with that kind of representation. So it really comes down to that combination of success and representation. With both of these, you're considered a meta deck, and with only one or none of them, you're considered a rogue deck. But with that being said, I believe that this particular format is a tier 0 fire format, with only a handful of decks being considered meta. Those decks, in my opinion, are going to be Snake Eye, Fire King, Branded, Fluandereeze, Voiceless Voice, and Kashtira. If you really wanted me to place these decks into tiers, I would say that the Fire decks are tier 0, Branded and Voiceless Voice are tier 1, and Fluandereeze and Kashtira are tier 1.5, tier 2. Every other deck, in my opinion, doesn't meet the criteria to be called a meta deck. But to try and make everyone happy and to talk about more traditional rogue decks, I won't be having these decks on my tier list: Labyrinth, Sprite, Vanadium, Dragon Link, and Raid Raptor. While I personally believe that all of these decks are rogue, they are the 5 best this format in my opinion. And if you want to hear more about them, check out this video where I go more in detail. Now, when looking at different rogue decks, we have to determine how good they actually are in this specific format. And to do that, I have 5 different categories to look at. The first one is going to be a big threat. This is for decks that are really threatening in the format today and can definitely steal wins against the top meta decks. Potentially threatening is for decks that have a good chance of winning against many different strategies in the format today, and I wouldn't be surprised if they topped, but it's going to be a bit harder than the big threat decks. The deck falls in the good players only tier if the strategy really requires to have a strong pilot playing the deck to perform well. Our better options tier is for decks that either have a really hard time in this given format but can see some levels of success depending on playstyle, variants, opponents, and things like that, or because the strategy itself is very similar to other decks that are more consistent or have a higher ceiling. And finally, we have our just don't tier. This is for decks that are having a really hard time this format. Basically, the deck itself can't keep up with the powerhouses in the game and even can't keep up with most rogue decks in the game today as well. Now that you know what we're looking at, let's go ahead and get started with our first deck in alphabetical order, being ABC. ABC is a really cool strategy that can do a lot of insane things. It can combo off very well, it has access to a lot of soft once per turn effects, and is easily able to create one of the scariest endboards in the game today. The problem with it though is that it loses to so many different cards. Depending on the hand, it can have a really hard time against Droll and Lockbird. It also doesn't help that the best decks in the format right now are weak to Dimension Shifter, and so is ABC. While the strategy can do a lot of cool things, it just doesn't do them well enough this format, and for that reason, it belongs in the better options tier. Up next is Centurion, and Centurion is a really cool strategy released in Valiant Smashers. The main gimmick is going to be to use their monsters as continuous trap cards and not continuous spell cards, which plays a role in this specific format because it means that if you use the effect of a Snake Eyes Flamberge Dragon, for example, to place a Trudea or a Primera in the spell and trap zone as a spell card, they can't actually summon it back out, which means it's pretty much lost for the entire game. The deck is easily able to play around what is arguably the best hand trap in the format today, being Ash Blossom, because they really only search once, maybe twice because of the draw off the effect of the Legatia. But what the deck really tries to do above all else is use Crimson Dragon to summon out Hot Red Dragon Archfiend King Calamity to be able to lock out their opponent from playing the game. They can do other things, but because this specific line is so powerful and can end a game in an instant, it really becomes the line that they focus on more so than anything else. So in my opinion, it belongs in the potentially threatening tier. Dark World is up next, and this strategy is terrifying. There are some decks in this format that are very difficult to beat because of the end board they put up. But what Dark World does better than almost any other deck in the game today is it gets rid of your resources effortlessly. They play cards like Gen and Ken, which can help facilitate them activating the effect of Silva to force you to put 2 cards from your hand to the bottom of your deck, which means you're starting off with fewer cards in your hand and a much harder chance of beating them in this game. And if they don't want to do that, they can set up a really powerful end board with multiple points of negation, including cards like Appaloosa, cards like the new Grapha Fusion monster, SP Little Knight, and whatever the case might be. The issue is you need to know when is the correct time to go for which line. Is it going to be the best decision to get rid of your opponent's resources, or is it going to be to go for the massive negate board? It really depends on the player to know which is going to be the best option for a given situation. So for that reason, Dark World belongs in the good players only tier. I really don't like Dinomorphia as a deck. I guess I'm just upset that it's better than Dinosaurs in this specific format, but it can see some levels of success. The biggest problem with Dinomorphia is going to be that you need to really manage your resources incredibly well, so you have to at least be a good player with the deck to manage them effectively. But what is arguably more important than that is going to be that the strategy itself has a really hard time going second because it's a trap-based deck. Right now, every single trap deck in the format outside of Labyrinth exactly has a hard time going second, and if you're relying a lot on winning the dice roll, it can be really challenging to compete at a high level over a long tournament. While the deck has upside, if you're going to play a trap-based strategy, you're better off playing something else. So for that reason, there are better options. Dinosaurs are my favorite deck of all time, and they really struggle in the game today for a few different reasons. The biggest reason is that their deck really struggles to deal with interruption if they don't have exactly Miscellaneous Saurus. If your opponent goes for an Infinite Impermanence or an Effect Veiler or an Ash Blossom, depending on your hand, you can just instantly lose the game. And most of the time, they're completely fine with you going for Miscellaneous Saurus to protect if they have Ash Blossom, because when you banish the Miscellaneous Saurus to extend, they can Ash that and you lose your biggest push in the deck. Sure, cards like Ground Xeno have allowed the deck to start playing through more cards and be a bit more consistent and start the combo a bit better, but honestly, it just isn't enough in this specific format when there are so many decks playing 12 to 15 different hand traps. So for that reason, just don't play Dinos. Exosister is a really awesome deck in this particular format. Basically, every strategy in the game today moves cards out of their graveyard to be able to activate certain effects, and all the Exosister monsters really capitalize off of all that. The deck is easily able to fit in about 12 different hand traps, including Dimension Shifter, which is insane in the format today. It's not a perfect deck by any means, but considering the format that we're in moves a lot of cards out of the graveyard, it is still a very strong option. And that's why Exosister is our first deck in the big threat tier. Gold Pride as a TCG exclusive archetype is a really cool strategy. The problem is, the support it's gotten over the past few months doesn't give it the ability to play at a high level. The deck loses to so many different hand traps in the format today. It also has a pretty heavy engine compared to other strategies as well. And if you can't give your opponent the life point lead, it can be really hard to just play the game. Honestly, just don't play Gold Pride. Goblin Biker is a really cool strategy, and I think the deck has a lot of potential in future formats when we get more support. Right now though, because the format we're in really focuses heavily on Link monsters and not Xyz monsters, the deck has a bit of a harder time compared to others. But the deck can still do a lot of really cool things and has a lot of unique forms of interaction. But for the time being, Goblin Biker goes in the good players only tier. Up next is Gren Maju OTK, and I kind of love that this deck is seeing some rise in popularity once again. The deck is essentially going to be like an 8-axis deck where it uses a lot of rank 8 monsters thanks to the dangers and Gizmekarochi to be able to spam the board and banish a lot of cards to create a massive Gren Maju to OTK the opponent. While it OTKs very well, there are going to be a lot of anti-meta decks that do a better job of stopping these powerful strategies. So for that reason, Gren Maju OTK belongs in the better options tier. Heroes are always going to be viable in some capacity. They have a very dedicated player base that's constantly evolving the deck to make it better than it was the day before. Sure, Dark Law is really cool and the Dark Angel Floodgate is also really solid as well, but the strategy itself has so much more to it than just that, and you have to know exactly what you want to do to be able to take this deck to the full potential. In my opinion, heroes are the poster child for the good players only tier. Marincess is up next, and this strategy has a lot of potential. The deck itself has a lot of really solid one-card starters and can play a lot of non-engine in the game as well to adapt to the current meta. It can easily create a really big towers monster that is very hard to out for a lot of different strategies, especially because in this current format, cards like Kaijus are seeing very little play. The fact they don't have to set Marincess Wave to negate cards is really cool, and they also have access to one of the most oppressive lines in the game by locking themselves into water monsters, using World Sea Dragon Zealantis to banish the board, and they can't summon back the monsters to their opponent's side of the field. Honestly, as long as Zealantis is legal, this deck will still see some play pretty much forever. It's not a top tier rogue deck, but it's definitely potentially threatening. I really like Phantom Knights as a strategy. It can be molded to do so many different things. You can easily play it with a lot of the Burning Abyss cards, and you can add the Horus engine to it, you can play the Armored Xyz cards. There are so many different ways to use the strategy, and finding out which one is going to be the most effective for a given format is really difficult to do. No matter what variant you're playing, it has a really good first turn combo, and it has great recovery options as well, and great ways to interrupt their opponents on their turn. But the issue I have with the deck is that it can be very difficult to find out which specific line is the best to go into in a given situation. So for that reason, it belongs in the good players only tier. Plunder Patrol as a deck is really weird. Because it relies so heavily on what the opponent tries to do, going first can be a challenge at times, even though we have access to the new Plunder Patrol ship Jord to be able to change attributes and get whichever Plunder Patrol ship you really want to out of the extra deck. But even with Jord in the picture, I would argue that a going second variant or a Runick Plunder Patrol deck is going to be even better than a pure going first deck. Basically, every single Plunder Patrol list has a really hard time in this current format and just can't keep up with the meta today. So for that reason, just don't play Plunder Patrol. Purrely might have fallen out of the top tier threats of competitive play, but it still is a really solid option against a lot of different decks. Sure, if you're a really good player on Purrely, then it's going to help, but a lot of the time, players in this current format have a really hard time outing a copy of Purrely Noir with 5 or more materials. Right now, the representation for Purrely is pretty low because the strategy at the current moment is a bit more expensive than other options, but once Rarity Collection 2 comes out and Purrely, My Friend Purrely, and Purrely Pretty Memory get all reprinted, the deck is going to be accessible to so many more players, meaning we're going to see an influx of players playing the strategy, which means eventually it can probably rise up the tier list even more. But for the time being, I still think Purrely is a really big threat. As for Red Dragon Archfiend or Bestial Red Dragon Archfiend, whichever way you want to go about it, I think this strategy is really cool, don't get me wrong, but there are going to be better ways to play dragons. If you want to play dragons in this format, you're better off playing Dragon Link or a Bestial Synchro deck list because they lose to fewer cards than a RDA deck does. The deck can still do a lot of really cool things, including Calamity locking their opponent thanks to Branded Etude. It can also set up multiple powerful Synchro monsters, and Red Zone with Red Supernova Dragon is still a very scary option. But there are just better dragon decks in the game today. So for that reason, it belongs in the better options tier. Up next is Runick Stun, and honestly, just don't play this deck. If you want to have friends by playing Yu-Gi-Oh, this is not the deck to play. But if you want to find competitive success, it's going to be tough to find a better option as a rogue strategy. The Runick cards are obviously crazy, but you also have access to powerful floodgates like Synchro Zone, for example, and you also have Imano Iwado and Inspector Border, which are two really annoying and powerful monsters. The deck doesn't solely rely on floodgates. Sure, they can definitely help, but it's not mandatory to play them all in this specific list because the Runick cards are so strong. Now you can use the Runick cards in other strategies, but Runick Stun did just get second place at YCS Medellin. So while you probably won't make any friends playing this deck, it definitely is a big threat. Salamangreat is up next, and this deck has seen a rise in popularity once again. The strategy got a few new pieces of support in the form of EMP Meow Mine and of course Promethean Princess, both which released in Phantom Nightmare. The deck is able to keep on extending and play through multiple different hand traps outside of course Nibiru, but the end board it puts up is also very threatening with Salamangreat Roar, Salamangreat Rage, and all the powerful monsters that it can set up as well. Salamangreat is a fan favorite deck that is seeing a lot of success in the format today, even topping regionals and YCSs, and for that reason I believe it's a big threat. Scareclaw is really struggling right now. The deck itself really needs to put opposing monsters in defense position because of the effect of Tryhard, and the fact that Link monsters are so prominent in the best decks today, it makes it really challenging. Honestly, it's just not the format for Scareclaw, so just don't play Scareclaw. Sharks are a really cool strategy with a ton of different ways to play the deck. You can play the strategy as a way to just set up a bunch of powerful negation tools thanks to cards like Totally Awesome, but you can also use the Armored Xyz cards to create more interruption. The deck has a lot of really solid starters and even more amazing extenders too, but it can be a challenge to play effectively. So for that reason, Sharks belong in the good players only tier. Moving on to Sky Striker. As a deck, I believe Striker is well past its prime and definitely not going to be a top tier threat. But if played correctly, Striker can perform decently well, mostly because of its engine. The engine itself, while it may not be as consistently powerful or have as high of a ceiling as many other strategies in the game today, if the ball gets rolling and the recycling of resources is effective enough, then you can definitely keep up with pretty much any deck in the format today. The problem is that it's much harder to do that today than it was when Striker first released. So while Striker's not a terrible deck by any means, there are better options. Superheavy Samurai is crazy strong. There's a lot of different lines that you can go through, either setting up a massive negate board with cards like Appaloosa, Therion King Regulus, you can go with SP Little Knights, Baronne de Fleur, and so on and so forth, but you can also set it up as an engine to allow you to play more decks. Basically, whenever you see Superheavy Samurai, I believe you're going to have a really hard time because the deck is so powerful, unless you have exactly Droll and Lockbird. The good news for Superheavy Samurai players is that Droll and Lockbird has kind of left the format in terms of main deck cards. It's seeing a lot of play in side decks, but not necessarily in the main deck, which means if you can win the dice roll, you'll have a really good chance to win game 1 and potentially the entire match. It's because of how flexible and strong the deck is that I believe it's a potentially threatening deck. Swordsoul has a much lower power level than a lot of other decks in the current format, but that's not to say the deck itself is bad by any means. The good thing with Swordsoul is that the entire engine is very compact and very consistent as well. It also has a lot of room for non-engine, which means a very common hand is going to be a way to access Moye, a worm monster, and then 3 hand traps, which is still very scary. The problem becomes when you open up hands that don't have access to Moye or these really easy, straightforward, linear lines that the deck can kind of struggle a little bit. That isn't to say that Swordsoul can't still succeed, but it's a bit harder to do so. So for that reason, it's a good players only deck. Traptrix is another incredibly popular deck, mostly because of how easily accessible the deck is and how low cost. The problem with it though is that, again, as a trap deck, it does struggle quite a bit when going second. Labyrinth is the only trap deck that actually has a pretty decent time going second. All the other ones tend to struggle, and Traptrix is no exception. Now when it goes first, it can set up a very scary end board, but that's not always going to be the case. Honestly, if you really want to play a trap deck, you're just better off playing Labyrinth, so for that reason, there are better options. TriBrigade Fire King is basically just a budget version of pure Fire King or Snake Eye Fire King. The deck itself can do some really cool things thanks to the TriBrigade cards. I mean, TriBrigade Revolt and Shurag is obviously really good, but the strategy is definitely just missing something. It's missing an extra piece of power that the strategy doesn't have thanks to the TriBrigade cards. But it's definitely still playable and can perform very well, but mostly because of the Fire King engine itself. A lot of the time, just because of how good the Fire King cards are in the format today, it can steal different games. So for that reason, it's a potentially threatening deck. Unchained is definitely weaker than it was a few months ago, but it still has the ability to perform very well, either as an engine in certain strategies or as its own pure deck. Unchained is able to play through a lot of different hand traps in the format today, and even with Sharvara at 1 copy, it's still able to put up some really scary end boards and recover its resources quite well too. Because of how much better it is at playing through a lot of different hand traps in the format today, I would say it actually has a better chance of competing against a lot of the top decks. And that's why Unchained is, in my opinion, a potentially threatening deck. And the last deck we're going to talk about today is going to be Yubel. Now I may be a bit premature here, but I think Yubel is a fantastic option in the format today, and it's going to keep getting better as well. Having the ability to fuse off with your opponent's entire board to create a massive Yubel fusion monster is obviously really threatening. It's also a pretty consistent strategy when you add in other cards in the deck, and it can play, of course, Dimension Shifter too. If you aren't ready to play against Yubel either as a pure deck or as a Unchained variant of Yubel, you're going to have a really hard time and honestly struggle quite a bit. I know it might be early, but in my opinion, Yubel is a big threat. And there you have it, my tier list for the best rogue decks in competitive Yu-Gi-Oh! Is looking like this over here. Now let me know down in the comments below. First of all, did I miss any decks that you want to see covered? If I did, let me know down in the comments. I'll make sure to comment what I think about that deck. And of course, did I make a mistake putting any deck in a tier that was too high, too low? Let me know down in the comments. If you made it this far in the video, you must have enjoyed it, so make sure to smash the like button. Remember, if we hit 250 likes on the video, I'll keep bringing you more tier lists in the future. and of course subscribe to the channel as well. We're on the road to 10,000 subscribers and we can't get there without your help. Make sure to follow me on Twitter and join the Discord server. Both are linked in the description, as well as my TCG player affiliate link. Whenever you use my link to make a purchase, it always helps the channel and it doesn't cost you anything extra. Thank you for watching, I hope you enjoyed it, and I'll see you all next time.